She put on a simple uniform to unravel a complex lie. She wanted to find the greed in her son's fiancé's eyes, the crack in the flawless facade that bothered her so much. She believed she was the hunter, the master of a game she had set up on her own home turf. But a disguise doesn't always expose the other person. Sometimes it only reveals who we become when we think no one is watching. And the deception she was about to find was a mirror. Vance Estate Vineyards wasn't just land. It was a silent kingdom, built from sweat and sun in the rolling hills of Napa Valley. Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, knew every single vine. She had wrestled a fortune from this soil, and because of that, she was suspicious of anything that glittered too easily, especially love. Her son, Julian, the heir to her empire, seemed utterly blinded by it. His fiancée, Clara, was a woman who, in Eleanor's view, seemed dangerously impeccable. That's why, on this particular weekend, Eleanor wasn't the owner of it all. She was Lena, the new housekeeper, hired to help out at the guest house where the couple would be staying. With her hair pulled into a tight bun and a uniform that hid her hands, calloused by both labor and command, she watched the luxury car glide up the gravel road. Out stepped Clara, elegant, serene, with a restrained smile that, to Eleanor, looked like a map of secrets. The test had begun. Eleanor just didn't realize the final exam would be for her. Julian, oblivious to everything, was overflowing with an almost naive happiness. He introduced Lena as part of the house staff and kissed Clara with the certainty of someone who feels at home in another's heart. Eleanor, now Lena, answered in monosyllables, her head bowed, polishing a wineglass that was already gleaming. Her job was to be invisible. And in her invisibility, she hunted. But Clara wasn't giving her what she expected. There was no arrogance, no sharp commands. On the contrary, there was a polite distance, an almost melancholic air about her that was intriguing. The first crack in Eleanor's plan appeared when the family's old gardener, while moving a wheelbarrow, dropped a terracotta pot, shattering it and scattering soil across the freshly washed patio. Julian didn't even notice, but Clara approached. Eleanor watched, bracing for the reprimand. Instead, Clara knelt, helped the man gather the dirt with her own hands, and said in a low voice, "Don't worry, accidents happen. Can I get you a glass of water? It's so hot out today." The small, genuine gesture didn't fit the villain Eleanor had constructed in her mind. Confusion was a new feeling, and she didn't like it one bit. The perfect opportunity for a checkmate came on the second night. While serving dinner, Eleanor, in a move she had mentally rehearsed, let a heavy silver tray slip. The crash echoed through the dining room, and an ugly scratch marked the fine hardwood floor like a scar. The silence that followed was tense. Julian jumped. Eleanor held her breath, ready for the explosion. She cowered, apologizing profusely, waiting for the fiancé to finally reveal her true colors, to scream about the damages. But Clara's reaction was the opposite of what she expected. She rose from the table, ignored the floor, and went directly to Eleanor. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern as she looked at Lena's hands. "Just leave this. It doesn't matter." Seeing the calculated panic on the housekeeper's face, she added in a low, conspiratorial whisper, "Don't worry, I'll talk to Julian myself. I'll tell him it was my fault that I bumped into you. No one is going to fire you over this." In that instant, the humiliation wasn't Clara's. It was Eleanor's, who felt small and dishonest, the architect of a malice that existed only within her. The rest of the dinner was a blur for Eleanor. She retreated to the kitchen, Clara's words echoing in her head. It was my fault. The plan was so simple. Prove the girl was a gold-digging fraud. But who was the real fraud here? Who was the one wearing a mask, setting traps and assuming the worst in people? Sitting on a stool in the back of the kitchen, the air smelling of rosemary and disappointment, Eleanor felt utterly defeated, not by Clara, but by herself. Her armor of certainty, forged over decades of building her empire, had cracked. She looked through the kitchen window and saw her son laughing with his fiancée on the porch. the moonlight drawing a peaceful outline around them. For the first time, Eleanor didn't see a predator and a prey. She saw two people connected by something that she, with all her wealth and power, could neither buy nor control. And she felt the terrible weight of the possibility that she, with her fear and her judgment, was the only real threat to their happiness. The silence that followed wasn't that of a failed plan, but of a truth crumbling to pieces. Her truth, the certainty that she was right, that she had always been right, disintegrated into dust, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her own prejudice. That feeling, when you realize the villain of the story might be you, it's sharp. Have you ever judged someone with absolute certainty, only to discover you were completely and painfully wrong? Answer with a yes in the comments if that's ever happened to you. I want to know I'm not alone in feeling this. The test was over, but Eleanor's investigation was just beginning. She abandoned the search for flaws and started searching for the truth. The next day, she called out of her housekeeping duties, claiming a sudden illness. From a distance, inside a discreet car that no one at the vineyard would associate with her, she saw Julian say goodbye to Clara with a long kiss. But the girl didn't get into a luxury car to head back to the city. Instead, she walked to the main road's bus stop and boarded a rattling public bus heading toward a neighboring town, a simple place with cobblestone streets and houses with peeling paint. Eleanor followed, her heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. She watched Clara get off and enter a small pawn shop, emerging minutes later with a cash envelope in her hand and a bare wrist where a delicate bracelet, a gift from Julian, used to be. Then Clara walked to a modest house at the end of a cul-de-sac. A tired-looking woman, whose shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world, came out to hug her. Eleanor parked farther down the street and watched. Soon, a young man who walked with a visible limp came out onto the porch and smiled when he saw Clara. The truth began to take shape, painful and clear. Eleanor strained to listen and could hear fragments of conversation carried by the wind. Physical therapy, so expensive. Don't know how we'll manage. The jewelry, the gifts, they weren't for show. They were to be sold. Clara's secret wasn't greed. It was desperation. It was a silent sacrifice made in secret to keep her family afloat, a burden she carried without ever asking for help. The next morning, Eleanor didn't put on Lena's uniform. She wore her own clothes, her posture that of someone who commands an empire, not with arrogance, but with the weight of responsibility. She didn't drive to the vineyard. She drove to the small town. She found Clara sitting on a park bench, staring at her phone with an expression Eleanor now recognized. It wasn't coldness, it was the exhaustion of someone fighting an invisible war. Eleanor approached quietly and sat down beside her. Clara recognized her immediately. Panic washed over her face, draining it of color. "Mrs. Vance, she began to stammer, her mind racing to find an explanation, an excuse for her double life. Eleanor raised a hand, a gentle gesture asking for silence. There was no accusation in her eyes, only a profound calm. She said nothing. She just held out a small card. On it was the name and contact information for the best pediatric orthopedist in the country. "Call him," Eleanor said, her voice firm but kind. "Tell him the patient's grandmother is requesting an urgent consultation. All costs, from travel to the treatment itself, have already been covered." Clara looked from the card to Eleanor's face, the tears she had held back for so long finally streaming down her cheeks, silent and heavy. The power dynamic had been completely inverted, not through humiliation, but through an act of grace. The woman who came to be judged was the one who, all along, possessed the greater strength. Clara couldn't speak. The sobs that shook her weren't from sadness or shame, but from a relief so profound it seemed to dissolve years of tension from her shoulders. It was the exhaustion of fighting alone, the end of a heavy secret, and the gratitude for a gesture she never dared to dream of. She didn't need to explain her story, her struggle, her sacrifices. Eleanor already knew, and more importantly, She understood. In that moment, Eleanor didn't see a stranger, but a reflection of her own youth, of her own fight to build a life from nothing. "Someone's greatest value isn't what they have in the bank," Eleanor said, her voice breaking the solemnity of the moment. "It's what they're capable of doing in silence for the ones they love." She stood up, and before turning to leave, she placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, a gesture that was both an apology and a blessing. "Take care of your family," she said, pausing before she finished. "Our family." With that one phrase, the circle was closed. Dignity wasn't found in winning a battle, but in admitting the war should never have existed in the first place. Sometimes we build high walls to protect the ones we love, without realizing those same walls trap us on the outside with our own prejudices. Eleanor went on a witch hunt, armed with a lifetime of suspicion, and in the end, all she found was humanity. She discovered that a person's character isn't revealed by the luxury they accept, but by the burdens they carry in silence, far from prying eyes. The story of Clara and Eleanor reminds us that empathy is the rarest and most valuable treasure, and that often the great secret we uncover about others is actually a profound lesson about ourselves that we desperately needed to learn. True vision isn't seeing the flaws in others, but having the courage to recognize our own. If this story touched you in some way, your like shows us that we're on the right path to telling what really matters. Tell me here in the comments what city you're watching from. I read them all, and make a point to respond with care to everyone who takes the time to connect. And if you believe in the power of stories like these, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every new subscription gives us the certainty and the fuel to continue this journey. I'm counting on your help. Don't go just yet. Choose one of the 2 stories I've left on the screen to watch next. I'll meet you there.